I'm Antonia, this is Perry Pictures, and today's tutorial is all about inking line art. Every line art secret I'm about to share with you applies to both digital and traditional art, and depending on which of these line art techniques you choose to use, you will be able to create a variety of popular styles. For this video, we will be using Sketchbook Pro, also known as Sketchbook Ink, and I have 3 very different examples of line art up on screen to help us get started. When you are drawing or inking your line art, there are 2 things to keep in mind: line weight and line consistency. Line weight can be broken down into 2 types. There's fixed line weight and variable line weight. And then for line consistency, that comes down to long, short, open, closed, or overlapping line art consistency. And I will demonstrate examples of each of these things to make them easier to understand. Since we're focusing specifically on the line art, I'm going to skip the sketching portion and pull up on screen 3 of my old sketches. I drew these on loose leaf paper and have never inked them before, so let's go ahead and use these to demonstrate 3 line art techniques. For this first one, I did write fine line and broad strokes on the sticky note, and by that I mean the same thing as fixed line and long strokes. If you think back to those 3 examples at the beginning of this video, this style is going to fit most closely with the center artwork that had the most detail and the thinnest line work. If you really like anime style line art and drawing lots of small details, this is going to be the line art style for you, and it is absolutely great for that. Before we begin inking our sketch, let's talk about what fixed line weight looks like and how to make it. Fixed line weight has consistent thickness and thinness to it at all times. This is particularly useful in animation and is frequently used in comics. If you are a traditional artist, one way to achieve a consistent or fixed line weight is to use hard-nibbed utensils like a ballpoint pen versus a brush pen. If you're a digital artist, you will want to look through your brush library for a brush that imitates a ballpoint pen or which does not respond to pen pressure sensitivity. For this, I will be using my felt tip brush pen, so my line weight won't be as fine as it would be with a ballpoint, but since it does not respond to pen pressure sensitivity, I'll still get a fixed line weight for this example art. Now is a great time to go over line consistency. For this line art style, it helps to have broad or long strokes, and for this drawing specifically, I am choosing to use closed lines, which means I won't be leaving any gaps or using tapered or implied lines. The benefit to drawing your lines with broad or long strokes is that your line art comes across very confident. If it is difficult for you to draw long, smooth lines and you're a digital artist, most drawing software has a line stabilization feature. I know I struggle to make smooth lines when I'm not picking up my pen very often, and so I use this feature a lot. In Sketchbook, it's located across the top toolbar next to the predictive stroke feature, and I have mine enabled now, which is why it's highlighted in blue. My steady stroke is adjustable, so I like to set mine to 40 out of 200 strength. If yours is also adjustable, test out a few different degrees and see what setting is the most comfortable for you. For my traditional artists who don't have steady stroke, I feel your pain. I know for me personally, when I know that I'm going to put aside time to draw traditional art, I try to minimize my caffeine intake so that I can have the steadiest hands possible while drawing, and usually reward myself after with a coffee, soda, or energy drink, and you know what? Tea works too. If you haven't already noticed, let me point out the amount of edit undos and erasing that I'm doing as I'm working on this character. When you want your lines to read as very clean and confident, it often means redoing a line until you achieve that look. And as we get more into the detailed accessories in her wardrobe, we start to see why using a fine thin line is so important when you're going for a fixed line art style. If we'd started with a thick line, by the time we got down to the smaller details, they would have been very difficult to draw. And I honestly can't say why I drew the eyes like this originally, but we're going to try and make this look work with the line art and see what happens. Not that you have to stay true to your sketchy lines. When you're doing your line art over your sketch, I fully endorse deviating to correct sketch marks that could be placed better if you were going to do a cleanup sketch without actually having to do that step for just a few small adjustments. I also adjusted the height of her shoulders so her long neck didn't seem so uncanny, so that is just one example of where you can make those kinds of adjustments. While this is one of my sketches, it's not drawn in my usual style. I believe at the time I was imitating a fantasy dark academia / Lolita style in order to enter a motion book contest called Frankenstein, a reimagining of Frankenstein on DeviantArt, and this was some years ago. I didn't finish my entry on time, but I did enjoy the process and experimenting with other aesthetics that I wouldn't normally draw. And it gave us this chance to work on the line art for it now, so it all worked out in the end. One of the drawbacks of this style is when you want to use your lines to imply form rather than simply using them as an outline. For example, if you look at the pleats of her shawl, the lines feel very stiff and a little difficult to read as folds in fabric. One way to make that detail a little more legible is to use variable lines that taper off as it runs across the garment, but since this is a fixed line weight drawing, we won't be able to use that to our advantage here. But we will be able to do that in the next drawing style, so stick around for that. One thing we can do to help create visual weight in a style with such thin line art is to fill in darker areas and add contrast. Ways that I added contrast to Fran Kinston's drawing here are to fill in the buttons down her front, the stripes of her sleeves, and the color of her hair. Once I add those darker elements, this character is going to pop off of the page. All that's left to do after we finish adding our contrasting elements is hiding the sketch layer, and then we'll be able to look at this drawing in all of its glory. The line art looks fabulous by itself, but this drawing would look just as good colored in, and I'm going to have a link down in the description to all of the drawings in today's video so that if you want to color them, you are more than welcome to do so. And if you do color them and share them on social, please tag me. I do have my links in the description as well. That said, let's go ahead and look at the second line art style, which happens to be my favorite line art style and the one that I use the most frequently. The second style we're going to talk about is variable line weight with broad strokes, and we'll also use some open and implied lines as well, and I'll talk about that when we get to those. The character I chose for this example is a ferret aviator and expert in flying paper airplanes. I was asked to do some test pages for another creator's comic couple of years back, and one of the characters in those test pages was this guy. I did lose a little footage due to some technical difficulties, but thankfully not much, so let's just go over what's already on the screen. Already, the tapered line art is doing us a lot of favors. When you look at the scarf and the way it twists in the middle, we're able to sell that contour with a much thinner line at the bend in the fabric than if it was as thick as the other lines. I've also used a dramatic shift from thick to thin line weight in the fluffy collar of his aviator jacket hood to imply a thicker texture. The regular jacket material under the hood has more of a consistent and straight line, and that's so I can differentiate it from the poof. And I used this same texturing technique on the cuffs of his sleeves as well, so that we're seeing that same floofy material on the cuffs as is on the collar. We can also use variable line weight to imply mass. Look at his pockets of his jacket. It's a simple shape, but it works better when the stroke gets heavier at the bottom than at the top. The reason for a slanted pocket to gape wider toward the bottom corner is because gravity pulls on the weight of the jacket material, and the tension at the top will hold it more taut. But the weight of the material hanging at the bottom is why it will gape. Another trick you can use to imply texture is to leave gaps in your line art as if they had, or maybe actually were, erased. The gaps between two lines that look like they should be connected are called implied lines. Our minds will fill in the blanks and assume that a line or contour belongs there, and with a fuzzy little face like this one, the features are easier to soften with implied lines rather than unbroken line art, which is why I chose to draw his face in the way that I have. Something else that I did to help balance this drawing was to leave out details that felt too clustered. In the original sketch, I had drawn in stitching around the seams of his hat and pockets, but when I pull back and look at the full image, it looks better without those small details because otherwise I have crammed too much visual weight into the top half of the character art compared to the bottom. That's not to say the rest of his body lacks effort, but that the whole composition lacked balance. To be honest, the bottom half of his body did require some critical thinking about how to draw this furry creature using broad strokes, when broad strokes have a smoothing effect. My solution was to break up the strokes into smaller ones, and when I would pick up and put back down my pen, I wouldn't put it back down in the exact same spot where I last left off. Having them slightly unaligned helps to create volume and less smooth contours for his body. Last but not least, I like to finish the style of line art with a heavy outline around the outer edges of my drawing, giving it an almost sticker-like appearance. This also helps to exaggerate the variation of line weight within the drawing, which gives it a richer appearance overall. And with that, this little guy is finished, and we are on to the third and final line art style for this video. For the last line art style in this tutorial, we are using the teddy bear sketch, and we're going to ink him with variable line art in short and overlapping strokes. This is a more sketchy looking line art style, and it works great for any artwork that is intended to stay in black and white, since a lot of the contouring and the shading is done with the line art itself. Line stabilization I've found can be somewhat of a hindrance here. It just depends on what kind of shape you're trying to make, and if you're using shorter strokes, it might be easier to make them with a quick flick of the wrist than it is with a carefully calculated steady stroke enabled mark. When inking this way, I found it's very useful to think of it not as drawing an outline, but as drawing around a 3D shape. This might be the most complex of the three line art styles because this one works best when you're basing your line art placement on contours of your objects and the lighting that you're using in your scene. For this bear, I've decided to use very dramatic Rembrandt-style lighting, so I'm filling in a lot of the area that is cast in shadow with line art. The more textured the object is, the shorter the line stroke that I'm using, which means the smoother the object, the longer the line stroke, such as with his cane. One thing to note, however, is that we don't want the lines to be too smooth or too perfect, or they might end up looking out of place. Like with the ferret's fur in the previous drawing, I am deliberately misaligning, ever so slightly with my pen strokes as I start and stop drawing the longer and smoother shapes. I'm also going to avoid using built-in rulers for the same reason. That's why I'm not going to use the square ruler as a shortcut for the milk crate, because it just won't work. It's going to look very foreign, very out of place, and like it's not really a part of this drawing. Another thing that I'm going to do in this drawing is use a lot more implied lines and broken lines. This kind of drawing is not going to work with a fill bucket tool if you're choosing to color it afterwards, so there's no point in trying to use closed lines with this. I'm just going to embrace the implied lines, I'm going to embrace the sketchiness of it, and that's going to help keep all of these objects looking cohesive. I am also paying attention to the direction I'm stroking my lines so that matching planes are all inked at the same angle, and if it's more of a rounded plane rather than a flat plane, I'm leaning more towards cross-hatching. You can see some matching planes on the shaded side of his legs and the shaded side of his hat, and you can also see some cross-hatching contours around the roundness of his torso. The brim of his hat is going to cast a lot of shadows underneath, so those are going to fall across his face, which means I am going to have to experiment a little and get creative in that area until I find something that I feel looks good. If it starts becoming difficult to see how the line art is turning out over the sketch layer, which is about what I was thinking around this part of the drawing, sometimes it helps to fill in the rest of the missing features sparingly, then turn the sketch layer off so you can see what else needs to be filled in or finished. Another part of this technique is to use your line spacing with intentionality. The harsher the shadow, the closer the line spacing is, and the more it overlaps. Conversely, the softer the shadow, the more space that you want to put in between your line work and the less it's going to overlap. This style of line art is kind of similar to painting in the sense that you really have to build up your layers and go from a wide to narrow view of the details as you get further into the drawing. At this point, I'm mostly just working on bringing each of my elements to the same degree of finish, adding a little bit of texture to my crate, and then a drop shadow in the same direction that the lighting is hitting everything else, and that completes the drawing. If this is the style of line art that you feel really drawn to, I hope this video helped you with those techniques so that you can draw in that way. I am really interested in knowing which of these three line art styles was your favorite, so do let me know down in the comments below. And if you choose to color any of these drawings, which there is a link in the description for you to go ahead and get these drawings for coloring purposes, I would love to see them, so please do tag me on social or drop them into Discord. I do have a Discord link down below if you're interested in joining our server. I hope this video was helpful to you, and if you liked it, please remember to like this video by hitting thumbs up, and if you haven't already, please do subscribe because I am making art and animation on my channel all the time, a lot of which are drawing tutorials, so please pop in, check out my backlog of videos, and let me know what it is that you want to learn next. Thanks, and see you next time. Bye!